Start with the traditional homage to the triple gem, and usually just the speaker does this. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So people can continue to meditate. In our tradition, meditation and a Dhamma talk are one and the same. Most of our teachers, when they talk about the essential teaching of Ajahn Chah, the sort of father of our lineage, they don't talk about his teachings on high attainments or deep states of jhana, of samadhi. What they bring up again and again was Longpo Cha's focus on two things which were available to everyone: right view and a sense of morality, ethics, samadhi and sila. In coming to the Buddhist path, it's so easy to get caught into the intellectualization, the high wisdom teachings, to, as so many of us often do, experience some deep state in our first months of meditation and then spend the next 10 years trying to get back to it, to lament our inability, say, to attain jhana or some other fruit of the practice which we've set up as a goal for ourselves. And yet what we forget is the simple power of right view and morality. These two things align us with something much deeper in ourselves, and they also allow us a context in which to encounter the most relevant fact of life, which is that it hurts. And it is imperfect and changing. And in the end, the shifting circumstances, the vortex of change around us is not worthy to be called a refuge. We use it as a path towards something that is a refuge. But without an understanding of where suffering fits in the picture, particularly as embodied in the Four Noble Truths and the directive to turn towards and comprehend our suffering, to place careful hands on it, and by doing so, to use the most difficult and salient, or one of the most difficult and salient aspects of existence in the service of turning ourselves into greater servants of the world and as a path to awakening. And if we don't do this, then suffering becomes, in some sense, unendurable and fracturing, and we can't find a place for it. Because there's no neutral stance towards suffering. Either we're turning towards it carefully or running away from it. And by placing it at the very center of the teaching, the Buddha is not saying that existence doesn't have its benefits or life is all suffering. What he's saying is this is an aspect of it, and when we run from it, we run from everything else which that poignant and intimate relationship with the world might also give us. So by turning towards it, by understanding our own patterns, difficulties, neuroses, by being with them despite its difficulty, we get a chance to let go of the craving that gives rise to more of it, to realize a sense of peace, the third noble truth, and to develop the path to that peace, which is the fourth noble truth. There's a story of a gangster kingpin in Thailand, Bon Pei, where my monastery, where I ordained, was. And he was the leader of a large ring of criminals that sort of ran the place. And one day, the abbot of the monastery there convinced him to come visit Ajahn in Isan, in eastern Thailand. And for 2 weeks, Ajahn had this man sleep and live just underneath his hut and carry his bag for him and just be with him constantly. And by the end of the 2 weeks, the criminal had been so moved by his encounter with this being that he returned to Bon Pei and to his gang. And the first thing he did was announce that all of them from then on would all be keeping the 5 precepts. And he acknowledged in doing so that he would basically be consigning himself to death without the brutal ethic that his criminality had provided him before. He couldn't maintain control. So he spent the next year making sure his family, his parents, his wife and children were cared for. And about a year later, he was killed. And yet, the fact that in those 2 weeks, something had changed in his life where he'd suddenly been given a sense of right view, of purpose, and of morality was enough to hold him and make him remain steady through everything, even the end of a life. And similarly, right view transforms the suburban existence which so many of us live, which on the outside can seem so attractive, but which can similarly dissolve the heart's purpose little by little in comfort, in distraction, and a sense of fracturing. It can give that life meaning again by contextualizing every moment as a chance to cultivate that view of the Four Noble Truths, to see the imperfection in it, to see our craving and let it go, to realize a measure of peace, calm, centeredness, and to give, to cultivate the Eightfold Path and brighten the heart. Every moment, even the most mundane, become an essential pathway towards the transcendent. So one sutta that the Buddha speaks about, or actually rather Venerable Sariputta, where they elucidate right view, is called, it's the Majjhima Nikaya 9, the 9th discourse in the middle length discourses, and it's called right view. And when you read through the Buddha's teachings, it's intimidating to see how many different angles he takes on elements, how many lists. We have a lot of lists in the Theravada. And what each of these is a different way of looking at experience that can be relevant in a moment. All of them aimed towards brightening the mind and seeing past and abandoning suffering. But the Sammaditthi Sutta goes into several more angles that are rare. The most quintessential approach to right view is the Four Noble Truths. It's a categorical teaching of the Buddha, which means it's always correct to apply in every moment. It's appropriate to see whatever stress is present, to let it go, to find a sense of peace, and to develop the heart. But there are other ways of embodying this right view, just as a beam of light given to a gem would, or a prism, would change into, various colors. Similarly, we have all these iterations of what it means to hold right view. And in different circumstances, different visions of the Dhamma, different ways of looking at things will resonate. So in this sutta, Venerable Sariputta begins by being asked by the other monks, what is right view? To what extent is the right view? And he says, when one understands the skillful and the unskillful, and the root of the skillful and the unskillful, one is said to be accomplished in right view. And what is the skillful? Abstaining from killing, abstaining from stealing, abstaining from sexual misconduct, abstaining from lying, abstaining from divisive speech, from idle chatter, from harsh speech, from ill will, from covetousness, from wrong view. And these 10 paths of wholesome action are contrasted against the 10 paths of unwholesome action, which are the embarking on any of those. And what is the root of the wholesome? Non-greed, non-hatred, non-delusion. And what is the root of the wholesome, or of the unwholesome? Greed, hatred, and delusion. So there's a few things to go in here. One is that this moment at the very beginning of the sutta links right view explicitly to morality, to sila. So those two quintessential seeds, those elements of right view and morality at the very start are yoked, and you understand how right view leads to that sense of care in one's actions. And many here know already of the 5 precepts: not killing, not stealing, abstaining from sexual misconduct, not lying, not taking intoxicants. The 10, what they're called, the 10 Kamma pata, the 10 courses of wholesome action and unwholesome action, is an expansion on those 5 precepts. So wrong speech in the precepts is just an admonition against lying. In the Buddhist conception, it is never all right to lie, no matter what the motivation. But in the 10, these other 3 elements of wrong speech are brought in, of abstaining from divisive speech, like divisive tale-bearing, abstaining from idle chatter, and abstaining from harsh speech. I believe I have that one right. Harsh speech? Yeah. And yet what's important here is that the Buddha in the precepts didn't completely, there is a place every now and again for those three. So while they're included in the list of unwholesome actions in the sense of they're things we can refrain from most of the time, the Buddha acknowledged that there were moments where, say, you do need to warn someone about another person. You do need to speak about a difficulty that someone's going through. So it's not prohibited always. But what we can do is take this as an encouragement to be extremely careful, because I think of all the things we fall into as modern people, it's probably gossip more than almost anything else. And this goes for monks too. And I think that there are various ways of really helping with this. Saint Teresa of Avila had a determination where she would never say something about someone that she wouldn't say to their face. Joseph Goldstein, for a full year, wouldn't talk about anyone that wasn't there at that time. That's a high bar. But what we can do is, whenever we're about to say something about someone else, especially in a negative way, we can put a caveat, a context in, and just say, look, I don't usually say things like this. I usually try to avoid speaking about others. I need to say one thing about this person in this moment. And then we say it, and then we wrap it up. And you begin to meet in this path people who hold that ethic of speech with that much beauty. And it is a profound support for trust and friendship. Ajahn Pasno is someone who's known for never gossiping about other people, and you just know you can trust them. It's difficult when you have friends who really like to gossip. So one helpful way to approach that is, if you have that one friend, then you can kind of lean into the wind a bit and say, look, I'm really trying not to gossip. Will you help me by just, letting me know when I'm starting to talk about other people? And maybe they pick up on the fact that you're actually talking a bit about them, but maybe they also really take it to heart. And as a community and building a community, this is an essential aspect is speech. This is where we create so much of our karma. I don't think many of us are breaking the first precept with one another, but those 10 or those 4 paths of unwholesome speech we do break. And there's so much room for refinement. Ajahn Bunyarit, one of Longpo Cha's teachers, his whole practice was to keep the 5 precepts in body, speech, and mind. And the purification that came from that was enough to supposedly bring him to awakening. But I think that the level of refinement was exceptional. So the roots of these unwholesome behaviors are greed, hatred, and delusion, and these are the root defilements in Buddhist thought. It's the pushing away, the pulling towards ourselves, and then delusion. And one monk famously asked Ajahn Chah, I see greed and hatred, but I can't see delusion. And Ajahn Chah says, you're riding a horse and asking where the horse is. Ajahn Panyavado says that greed and hatred are the 2 arms of delusion. So what's important here is seeing that, first of all, it's very useful to identify your main defilement in this way. What do you find when you enter a room? Do you see all the things you like and want? Do you see the things that are wrong? Are you just kind of confused? It's a good test. And depending on which of these characters, we call them charitas, you have, your practice can be different significantly. Most of us have a nice mix of all 3, but you will find a dominant often. If you really like sweet food, you're probably greed. If you the Visuddhimagga has a whole list of ways you can determine it. It's difficult because labeling people in this way isn't always great. But it is helpful to know if you have a lot of aversion, you can really lean into metta practice. And you might have to be a bit more careful about practices of looking at death, of impermanence. And it's also beautiful to know what each of these character types mature into. Greed matures into faith. Aversion matures into wisdom. Delusion matures into equanimity and spaciousness. And one of the other important things is the last three of these unwholesome and wholesome paths of Kamma is covetousness, ill will, and wrong view. And when the Buddha speaks about abandoning these in these sutta, or when very Venerable Sariputta does, he speaks about abandoning obsession with greed or with covetousness, abandoning obsession with ill will, abandoning obsession with wrong view and with the conceit I am. This last week, I've had a lot of people come, several, and talk about how these old patterns just keep coming up. How they're in some ways barely able to kind of hold themselves together in this moment. And wasn't practice supposed to make things a bit easier? And what's so important to realize there is that it's very common when we begin to practice for old sankhara, what we call programs, these patterns of personality, of habit, of memory, of neuroses, of suffering, to come up. Because we've been running from them for so long. And often, the fact that we finally stopped, my parents always compare it to stopping the car and having all your luggage come forward and hit you in the back of the head. This is what kind of happens when we practice. Often when people encounter jhana for the first time, they'll cry for a long time, as in their mind they feel kind of the pain of every break in their morality, every departure from the path that they've had. And yet it's a purification process, and it's very useful to remember that even as that storm comes, every condition we're giving to ourselves now is wholesome. Every part of the path, no matter how much it seems like the meditation is just you trying to keep yourself together, it's a wholesome condition you're putting into place. You're trying to maintain mindfulness, you're watching, you're caring. So this karma is karma that is wearing itself out. It has momentum and a lot of it. One nun I know compared the path to scrambling around a latrine with a toothbrush, which is a terribly attractive way to talk about our practice, but there's truth to it. This is a long path, and we have a lot of stuff to work through. But what's useful to remember is when those patterns of greed, of hatred, of delusion return, that if we aren't feeding them, if we aren't obsessing with them, if we aren't attaching them to the conceit I am this greedy person, I'm always like this, I always slip this way, I always mess up. If we look at it in a phenomenological lens, as here is the residual momentum of something that has been cultivated for most of my life, then we can let it pass and acknowledge that because we're not feeding it, because we're not becoming drunk on it, and because we're not feeding on it, then it's not a sign that the practice isn't working, it's a sign that the practice is working. And it's just useful to get a feel for when we're slipping into feeding that Kamma. The unwholesome roots of these unwholesome paths of action, greed, hatred, and delusion, covetousness, ill will, wrong view, they're compared to the roots, and roots draw moisture from something. So sense if you're feeding off of something. Is the residual argument from last month just an echo, or have you decided to replay it 10 times since your morning shower? And if you imagined yourself as an internal little character and saw what it looked like for you to be feeding off of that, what would that look like? Would you want someone to see you like that? Or you can ask yourself if you'd pay to see that movie again, because you know which movie it is and you've seen it again and again. The Buddha compared our obsession with our sense desires as a dog gnawing on a blood-smeared bone, looking for nourishment. And what's so significant in that metaphor, as with so many of the Buddha's metaphors and analogies, is that what the dog tastes is its own saliva. The craving is what we want. We like the rush of craving and moving through a fantasy, and it doesn't necessarily matter what the fantasy is. We're feeding off of our own saliva. It's a really gross image, and it's totally appropriate. So what we're moving towards is not... Another person asked this morning what you do when you're driving to this gathering and you're not feeling supported by everyone around you in your practice, and you had a really hard week and all this stuff is coming up. How do you find refuge? How are you held through that? Especially if you don't want to burden others. And it's important to see that what we're cultivating, we speak so much in terms of letting go, but it's important to see what we're holding to more and more. We're replacing that junk food, that blood-smeared bone, with real nourishment. And it's more subtle, so it's harder to see, but it's far more lasting and less fragile. So we're replacing it with that sense of calm that you get when you sit for 20 minutes every morning in what is our basic hygiene as practitioners. You're getting it in the sense of pleasure that begins to come out of samadhi, in that gentle glow of warmth that you get from cultivating metta for 10 minutes every day, which everyone really should do, even right when you wake up. And you're getting it from the sense of kalyana mitta, which is the Pali word for beautiful friendship. Kalyana is beautiful, mitta is friend, which you get when you come into a space like this and meet people who are not here because you're especially funny or your personality matches theirs especially well, but because you share something far deeper. And you notice that as a quintessential element of communities like this is because there's a purpose above and beyond just the machinations of personality and interpersonal dynamics, that there's a solidity and a stability, and you can trust people here. And that's worth an immense amount. You're replacing it with the 3 refuges of the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. And as you cultivate every one of those positive paths, you find that it's another source of nourishment. And because it's not dependent on external conditions, but rather on an internal brightness that comes from, say, meditation, from keeping good morality, that sense of self-worth, from purpose, it's stable in a way that the things that we chase after with the unwholesome paths are not. That's the other great insight of that first iteration of right view, is the understanding that we are either on one path or the other. Every moment is that chance to decide whether you, when you find your loved one's glass in the sink unwashed, do you just wash it? Do you make a kind of angry comment? Do you wash it and put it away, dry it, and then bring your, significant other another cup of water without making a passive-aggressive comment, maybe? How far can you go to turn every moment into a gift? The Buddha says that just as a container fills with water drop by drop, so our goodness or our unwholesome aspects are filled little by little. Every action matters. Every moment is pregnant with intention, and therefore is a chance to cultivate something really meaningful. Not a lot goes on at monasteries, but you can train the mind at them, because each action is taken as a means towards something else. So that's the first paragraph of the sutta. We'll move on to that other one later, I think. That's enough for now. We have a chance for questions or things people would like to talk about. The next section of that sutta gets into the nutriments, which is really interesting, and then into dependent co-arising, which is the most complex psychological system in Buddhism, maybe. And we can just, I think 10 minutes is not long enough for that, so next time.
And really trying to be mindful of the conversation, just watching where it's going. But yeah, like when other people are speaking and starting to gossip or saying something that's really negative or doesn't feel right, just some ways to kind of navigate that and move it in a different direction. Something I've been trying to practice with.
So the question is, when this person has been working with right speech, and how do we learn to skillfully steer conversation in wholesome directions when we sense it's going towards regions of gossip and other unwholesome areas, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
I think one thing is honestly becoming more judicious with the relationships. We don't want to be judgmental, but we do want to be judicious. And the Buddha says that associating with the wise is one of the greatest blessings, and it's one of the foundations of stream entry. And there really is a place for those people who gossip to us a lot, or who it's difficult to have a wholesome conversation with. It's okay to put those down a little bit more, and to acknowledge that we're not actually hurting that person necessarily, because what we're feeding them in them when we're engaging in conversation like that is not a good part of them, and it's not something that's going to bring them happiness. We're feeding the part of them which is going to make them suffer. And that's one of the beautiful parts of looking at people not as discrete entities, but as mixtures of good and bad sankhara, skillful and unskillful, like elements. Sankhara is the word we use for programs or personality patterns. Is that you can really decide what you're feeding in that person and what you're not. And sometimes pulling away from someone a bit can actually be it can be very helpful in the end. And for those relationships where we don't have that option, or when we do have to interact with that, I just find it's a really beautiful endeavor, is can you find the thread of Dhamma in someone's conversation? And so often that takes the form of questions. And usually there's something you can touch in a conversation that really means something to someone. If it's their kid or there's a meaningful element or thread in so many conversations if you can find it. And often that takes the form of questions, I think, and listening. Other times, it's okay to put up with a little bit of awkwardness. Like if someone keeps, and that's going to be natural, like if someone keeps bringing up the gossip and you're kind of just quiet, it's awkward. And, you need to work with that, but it's also okay to be strong in that. And people will trust you more for it by a great deal, I think, over time. Yeah, but it's a tough one in the world. Steer away from email as well, I just think email's a real problem. Yeah, and just, yeah. Good luck on that one. Yeah, and I really do find that's the beauty of being with people who are on the same page is it's less of an issue. So, yeah.
Could you clarify a little bit what is meant by idle chatter in this context?
Yeah. So the Pali word, anyone? Sampapalapa, yes, it's the best Pali word, one of them. It's completely appropriate. So idle chatter, asampapalapa, is it's speech that, the Buddha gives a very clear definition of something he calls animal talk, which is the things monastics aren't supposed to talk about. And it's like kings, robbers, ministers of states, talks, speech about the origins of things, gossip of the well, gossip of the street, pretty much everything but the Dhamma. So, which is good to keep in mind. I've been in situations where I've tried to hold that, and it's gotten really weird. So I've heard someone compare idle chatter sometimes to the grease you put on a bicycle wheel or a chain. Like you need a little bit to keep things flowing. How are you? How's it going? Weather's nice. Seahawks, I don't know what. And that's fine. But if you just keep pouring it on, you sense when the chain gets really greasy and it gets all over your hands. So I just find it's very much a felt sense. When is there that sense of almost nausea of you wasting your time? Because that's, for me, the most salient, almost physical guide on this whole path is when I feel like I'm wasting what time I have. And it's a sense of slight nausea. It's what guided me to robes. And I think you can feel it in most situations when you need to step away. So yeah, idle chatter, if taken as the animal talk categories, if you Google that, animal talk, Buddhist, you'll see the whole list, but idle chatter has to go in, we need to use some of those things, but you can usually steer them in a way that's somewhat wholesome too. So yeah, it's just speaking for the sake of speaking. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's why I think it's nice that there's not a strict definition of it, because like we were saying, like sometimes you have to reach through someone's language to touch them, and sometimes that is, you have to work towards that. But once again, it's which part of that you're feeding in them. Are you just feeding the kind of frantic energy that needs to talk? Or are you able to kind of discern that one thread that really is trying to say something deeper? Are you able to have the deeper conversation? in Buddhism, there's a list of 4 kinds of eloquence. And it's eloquence in principles, which is the ability to connect any conversation to its underlying principles. Eloquence in Dhamma, which is ability to kind of connect a conversation to sort of dharmic overlay of practice, where it fits on the path. What is it? Sort of freedom of words, being able to use words as a playground a bit. So ability to change phrasing and meet people where they're at, and that's really useful, using like the vernacular of someone. And then the 4th is sort of this, the last one's very hard to translate, but basically, can you try to find, because everyone has the same, we're all dealing with suffering and hunger to be touched and acknowledged and seen. And can you hear that thread below someone's chatter and find a way to speak to that? And that is hard. And sometimes it's as simple as really just listening very, very carefully and quietly, Sometimes people often don't have a chance to just speak to others. So it's a great question.